Episode 6 begins at the Gabor estate. That's Pizzazz. She's looking at a newspaper while listening to music. But then one day, Pizzazz spotted an advertisement that catches her attention. So Pizzazz just told her Bemis, listen to this. The advertisement said, quote, I'm a big fan of Jim and the holograms. The Pizzazz says, wait, that's not all, because the advertisement also says that someone, whoever it was, is willing to pay big money on any information about Jim's identity. You can tell that three of the Misfits seems delighted to hear this news. But wait, Pizzazz says, here's a catch. The advertisement also says that whoever Jim's fan is very desperate. Then Pizzazz told her Bemis, do you realize what this means? The Pizzazz says, this means one thing. Whoever this fan is who posted an advertisement in the newspaper has given us an opportunity to give away Jim's identity, and he's willing to pay big bucks for it. So you know what this means. That means the Misfits are going to meet this mysterious millionaire who lives in a big mansion. So that's what they did. So, meanwhile, at the Wentworth mansion, so by the time that the Misfits arrived, the butler went ahead and let them in. And by the time that the Misfits went inside, they just couldn't believe it. There were a bunch of pictures and posters of Jim everywhere. Then suddenly, minutes later, Prescott Wentworth went down the stairs to meet up with the Misfits. So after Prescott went downstairs and met with the Misfits, he says, pleased to meet you. The first thing I want to do is welcome you to my residence. Why, thank you very much, Pizzazz said. Next thing that Prescott did was to give the Misfits the money to say, I just can't wait to see who Jim really is. So Pizzazz told Prescott, gee, we don't really know yet, but if you can give us some time. Then Prescott asked the question, what do you mean you don't know? And he started throwing a fit everywhere. So after Prescott's short fuse, that's when the mistress decided to escort him to the living room. So after Prescott was escorted to the living room, that's when Roxy says, well, we may not have known who Jim really was, but we do have a plan. So then Prescott asked, did you say a plan? What kind? So, Pizzazz at the mistress says, I'll tell you what we'll do. If you can give us some money to loan for this entire operation. So, Prescott wants to know, what kind of operation do you have in mind? Then Jetta speaks up in her case to say, well, you see, it's top secret. Of course, Pizzazz agrees with Jetta. Then tells Prescott, unless you're not interested or anything. Just when the Misfits were about to leave, then Prescott says, wait a minute. Okay, I'm interested, but there's only one condition. I don't want to make Jim all upset. Then Prescott says, I'll be ashamed of myself if I hurt Jim in any way. Then Rusty asks the question, why would we want to do that? So you know what this means. Prescott has no choice but to make a deal with the Misfits. So meanwhile, at Starlight Music, that's Jim stepping outside when a limousine came to pick her up. Before that could happen, Jim was told by the chauffeur that Kimber was telling him that he must take her to Starlight Mansion right away. But that's not all, the chauffeur says. Kimber also says it's part of your birthday present. But it's not my birthday, Jim said. But since the something was off with the chauffeur somehow, so she has no choice but to get into the back of the limo, which she did. So the chauffeur went ahead and take her to Starlight Mansion, or so Jim thought. So, long story short, after the chauffeur and Jim had had a conversation with each other, they arrived at the Starlight Mansion, or so Jim thought. But that's not the Starlight Mansion, but Jim was unaware of it. So before Jim can step inside the mansion, the Starlight Girls wished her a happy birthday, Bonnie, Chrissy, and Ashley. And by the time that Jim goes inside with the Starlight Girls, the holograms wished her a happy birthday too, or so Jim thought. They were the holograms. At first, Jim seems surprised, but then tries to brush it off and says, thanks, but it's not my birthday. So Kimmer wants to know from Jim, what's with you anyway? So Kimmer agrees to speak with Jim in private. And so, as both of the women were walking in the hallway, then Jim said, if there's only one person that knows what my birthday is, and that would be my sister, my real sister, Kimber. So Kimber told Jim this suggestion, maybe I should go get her. So Jim suspected it must be a joke somehow. And then she told Kimber, well, whatever this prank is, this is not very funny at all. So Jim told everyone, I don't like to be rude, but I think I'm going to go to take a nap. So she heads off to the bedroom. So after Jim arrives in the bedroom, she sits down on the bed and then asks herself, am I crazy? Am I losing my mind? What's going on? So she went ahead to lay down to take a nap. So we go into Jim's nightmare sequence by the Song of Nightmare by the Holograms. So after the song came to an end, that's when Jim woke up and saw Rio, or so she thought. So Rio asked her, are you okay? I heard you screaming. What's going on? It's just a nightmare, that's all, Jim says. You want to talk about it? Rio asked. Well, you see, at first Jim was going to accidentally let slip that she was Jerica, but then she had a second thought. So Jim told Rio, I think it's best if we didn't speak of it. So Rio wants to know from Jim, what's going on with you? Well, you see, everything's been so weird lately, Jim said. The first thing that Jim told Rio about a limousine that was arranged by Kimber to take her to the mansion, claiming it was Jim's birthday, but it really wasn't. Then Rio claimed a case to Jim to say if the Starlight Girls knew who you really were, then I must have. So Jim asked the question, how could you have known about it when the real Rio didn't? Since when did you find out about it? So Jim sensed that something was off and demanded to know from Rio who told him about it. So after Jim found out about it, and of course Jim tries to brush it off and says, that's impossible. How could you have known about it? Jim asked this to Rio, but then suddenly Ashley and Chrissy of the Starlight Girls just told Jim Video is waiting for her in the living room. So after Jim agrees to go with Chrissy and Ashley of the Starlight Girls to the TV room, that's when she met up with Video and the holograms, or so she thought. So what Video, or Vivian for short, just did was to put in a videotape for Jim as a surprise. So by the time that Jim arrived with Chrissy and Ashley of the Starlight Girls, Jim wants to know from Video if she was part of the prank or something else. Well, of course I am, Video says, and the truth is, I wouldn't miss it for a world, not even for a second. So after Video and Jim went ahead to sit down on the couch, she says, okay, here goes. This is your life. So Jim went ahead and played a videotape on a VCR, and what Jim saw on TV was shocking. The first thing that Jim sees was herself when she was a baby, having a bottle on her high chair and the stuffed bear on the floor. Then the next thing that 1 year old Jim did was to throw the bottle at the camera. Then back to the living room, Jim, the real Jim, just said to Kimber, wait a minute, because she sensed that something was off with the documentary that Video made, the videotape itself, but Kimber silences her. The next thing that Jim sees was Jim, now 3 years old, having a microphone, and she's in her pigtails in a blue dress. Then the next person that Jim saw was her own mother, who was standing right next to the 3 year old. You can tell she was very happy, very proud to say the least. Then finally on the videotape, what Jim saw next was herself at 8 years old in a yellow dress and has a yellow hat to match. The last thing she saw was Jim putting on her lipstick. Well, that did it for Jim. It was the final straw, and so she turned off the tape player. So Jim says, all right, that's enough. I feel like I'm going crazy here. Then Video, or Vivian for short, took the tape back and then told Jim, if you didn't like my documentary so much, you should have just said so. So after that, Ashley, Chrissy, and Video left the room. And of course, Asha just told Jim, you see what you did? You've hurt our friend's feelings. Then Shayna, or it looks like Shayna, said to Jim, and Video has worked so hard to work on your birthday present for you. Then Jim told the others, but that woman on the tape is not even me. Then Kimber goes next to speak in her case to say, if that's true, then who are you anyway? What do you mean by who am I? Jim asked. Then Kimber says, who are you really? But what Jim doesn't realize is that inside the surveillance room, she didn't realize that she was in the Wentworth mansion and not the Starlight mansion itself. And watching her were the Misfits, and of course Prescott Wentworth. And just when Jim, back with her in the living room, was about to accidentally let slip to Kimber, or what seemed to be Kimber, she says, wait a minute. Then Jim asked the question, why are you acting like you don't know who I am? And why did Rio ever say that he does? Before Jim left the living room, she said, something weird is going on around here. But I'm here to tell you, Jim said, I'm not happy about this at all. And so she left the living room. But what Jim didn't know is that the moment she left the living room, she didn't know that that's not the real Kimber or her friends. They were really actresses. And one of them who pretended to be Kimber saying, darn, and we almost had her that time. What Jim also didn't know is that one of the surveillance cameras was in the living room the moment she left. So back in the surveillance room, Possess and Roxy were very disappointed that the actress almost had her that time back in the living room. So when Prescott shows up minutes later, he told Possess of the Misfits, maybe we ought to call this off. Jim's getting all upset, and I don't like this at least a bit. But Possess of the Misfits soon dismisses him and said that there's no way. We didn't come all this way for nothing. Then Pizzazz makes it clear to say, we're not going to rest until Jim tells us who she really is, and we won't rest until we do. And why is that? Because Jim and Prescott should have realized right then that it was all part of the plan. Later, Pizzazz just called in all the actresses that were pretending to be Jim's friends, the holograms that is, for a meeting. You can tell that Pizzazz is not exactly happy that the actresses didn't do their job right, so she tells them that we didn't pay you off to do nothing. So in Pizzazz's case, she told the actresses that they're not going to arrest the Misfits, that is, till they get Jim's real identity. Then the actress who pretended to be Usher to say, hey, this is not our fault. Then the actress who pretended to be Usher says, if she had known that something must be off somehow, then she would have suspected it by now. Then Roxy goes next to speak in her case to say that she can really care less about it. Then Roxy said in her case that she and the Misfits will do what it takes to get Jim's identity to be revealed, and they'll do it in extreme measures whenever necessary. So Pizzazz agrees with Roxy. Then we go into the Who Is She Anyway song by the Misfits, the same one they did since episode 16 in the last season. So after the song came to an end, the actress that pretended to be Kimber says, okay, you got a point. Then another actress that's pretending to be Shayna to say, please give us one last chance, okay? So Pizzazz told the actress who pretended to be Shayna says, fine, but one last chance is all you're gonna get. So Pizzazz told the ladies, look, if Jim doesn't give us her secret and soon, then I'm warning you and telling you right this minute, you will never work for us again. So in other words, in Pizzazz's case, she's threatened to fire them on the spot. So meanwhile, at the Starlight Mansion's rehearsal room, the real holograms, are starting to get worried. And Kimber said that Jim should have been back from Starlight Music, but now she's not. And Shayna finds it very weird because she says it's not like Jim to not show up at all, unless something bad happens. So Aja, who agrees with Shayna, and says, we gotta go see Synergy and she'll tell us what's going on and what happened with Jim. Anyway, back at the Wentworth mansion, so when the fake Kimber came back and asked Jim, what are you doing? We had to rehearse for tomorrow's concert, Jim. So let's cut with the practical jokes and let's go practice. So that's what the fake holograms did. So the fake Asha asked the question, couldn't we just rehearse a little later? I don't think so, Jim says, because we've wasted enough time as it is. But then suddenly, when the fake holograms are not playing, so Jim asks, what's wrong? Did you forget to play the instruments or something? I guess we don't know that song, the fake Asha said. And then Jim suspected that the fake Asha had the guitar on the wrong way. So the fake Asha says, oops, sorry, and then she switched it. So when Jim tried again to rehearse, this time the instruments were played all wrong. Back in the surveillance room, Possess saw that the actresses that were pretending to be holograms messed up, and she said that Jim must have suspected it something was off somehow. Roxy, who agrees with her, says, we gotta do something to get us out of this mess. Back with Jim with the fake holograms, and that's when Jim pleaded her case to say how the fake holograms must have forgotten how to read or to play music. So when Jim demanded the fake Kimber to play a tune for her, instead, Kimber passes out, or so Jim thought. So when Jim ran over to the fake Kimber, she says, "What happened? Are you okay?" So the fake Kimber asked the exact same question she asked earlier. "Who are you?" Then Jim told the fake Kimber, "It's me, Jim, remember?" "I don't even recognize you," the fake Kimber said, and demanded to ask who she really is. But again, Jim was not aware that watching her were the Misfits in the surveillance room. So meanwhile in the surveillance room, both Pizzazz and Roxy at the Misfits say, "At last, she's going to tell us who she really was." Also in the surveillance room was Prescott. So Prescott goes first to speak in his case to the Misfits to say, "You promised me you wouldn't hurt her. Now look what you did. You're making her all upset." Jetta goes next to speak in her case to Prescott to say, "Oh, pipe down, will you?" Then, long story short, when Jerica arrived to see Jim and her fake holograms, she was surprised. Jim, that is. Back with the mistress and Prescott in the surveillance room, Pizzazz got upset to see that the actress who did Jerica showed up 2 hours late, but showed up at the set wrong time. Prescott begs the mistress to please stop this because he said in his case to say by asking this question, "Can't we just call this off before it gets too far?" Also, Prescott said in his case he's getting worried that Jim will crack for sure. So Jenna, however, dismisses him and says, "Well, you wanted to know who Jim is, right?" Then Jenna, however, "You can rest assured that you're going to find out sooner or later." Back at Starlight Mansion, when Holgrens went to Synergy's room, they wanted to know from Synergy what happened to Jim. Where did she go? Well, Synergy was more than happy to answer that. She told the Holograms that as of this moment, she's in the exact replica of Starlight Mansion. Anyway, Synergy was about to show Kimber where the exact duplicate of Starlight Mansion is. There's a problem. Because not only did the Holograms find out where Jim is, but that's not all. There's a bunch of actresses pretending to be Jim's friends, and of course, Jerica herself. Then Synergy says, "Wait, there's more, because whoever's pretending to be the holograms in Jerica, Jim's in serious trouble, and the worst of it all, she's about to expose her identity to everyone who wants it so bad, desperately." Now that the holograms knew that Jim's in serious trouble, Kimber wants to know from Synergy if Jim can be contacted somehow, so that they could warn her. But Synergy said that there's a problem. There's no way that she can contact Jim. But Synergy says that there's something even better. Instead of contacting Jim because of those surveillance cameras everywhere, instead, I can take you to Jim, and I can guide you on the way. Asha agrees with Synergy's suggestions, so with no time to lose, the holograms must get to the Wentworth estate. So back at the Wentworth estate with Jim and the actresses that surround her, that's when Jim decided to confront with the fake Jerica. So after Jim confronted with her, she turned around at her fake bandmates and says, "Oh no, you don't." Now you can tell that Jim had reached her limit and says, "Listen, everyone, whatever's going on, I don't think any of you are being honest with me. But one way or another, I'm going to get to the bottom of this." And then after that, she heads off. Back in the surveillance room with the Misfits and Prescott, and that's when Prescott told Jim that he's the only person that will speak the truth. So finally, Prescott had reached his limit and told the Misfits, "Enough is enough. I've had what I could take, but I can't take any more. I'm putting an end to this right now." But Roxy had to stop him and says, "You're not going anywhere." So Roxy demanded to have Prescott sit back down, but he refused and told them, "No way." Then Prescott told the Misfits, "You had upset Jim long enough. You've gone too far." Then Prescott spoke in his case to say, "I don't care who Jim is anymore." Then Prescott also said that he had never intended to let it happen. Then Prescott said, "I think, in my opinion, I think I'd rather just forget the whole thing." So Jetta says, "I think we should keep him busy until we find out who she really is. Jim, that is." So the Misfits decided to put Prescott in a closet. However, Prescott says, "You can't do this to me. I have to talk to Jim. After all, she deserves to know the truth." So after Prescott was locked in the closet by the Misfits, Stormer was getting worried. Then asked Possess, "Will he be all right?" "Don't worry, he'll be fine," Possess says, "once we get what we after." Back with the holograms, they're trying to rush to get to the Wentworth estate. So Kimber says, I hope we get to Jim and reach her very soon. So back with Jim at the Wentworth estate. So Jim says, Synergy, if you can hear me, you're my last chance and hope. But instead of walking through a wall, she instead collides into it, and that knocked Jim out unconscious on the floor. Minutes later, when Jim woke up in a hospital bed, or so she thought, that's when the fake Kimber's voice is telling Jim, you're going to be okay. So what the fake Kimber said is that Jim's in the hospital, or so Jim thought. And so Kimber says, you just hit yourself in the head. You're going to be fine. So Jim made an omission with her fake hologram friends to say, I guess I learned the hard way that this mansion that I am now is fake. And so were the actresses pretending to be you guys. I guess I learned that the hard way, huh? So Jim sat up in bed and says, well, I guess I've been Jim long enough. But Jim was still are not aware that watching her were the mistress in a surveillance room. Pizzazzo, the mistress who agrees with Jim while watching her, she says, well, that's the best idea I've heard all day. So Roxy, who agrees with her, says, this is it. She's going to reveal herself any minute. But then, at the last minute back with Jim, that's when she heard Kimber's voice, the real Kimber, who said, Jim, don't! So you know what this means. The real holograms have stopped Jim just in the nick of time. Then Asha goes next to speak in her case to say, bad news, Jim. These holograms are not us. They're actresses pretending to be us. In other words, what Asha's telling Jim that those actresses are imposters. Of course, Kimber told Jim the worst news is that someone wants your real identity and wants it really bad. And guess what? This hospital room's a fake too. And then approaches the fake Kimber and says, nice try, ladies. Then Kimber says, I'm afraid this charade is over. Oh, really? The fake Kimber said. Then the fake Kimber asked Kimber a question, the real Kimber, that is. How would I know you're not a fake? Well, see for yourself, the real Kimber said, and snatches the wig off the actress that pretended to be Kimber. The other two actresses, pretending to be Shayna and Rhea, looked at each other and said, uh-oh, we've been found out. Let's get out of here. Also leaving was the actress that pretended to be Aja, and so all three of the actresses left. When back in the surveillance room, Jetta of the Misfits says, we better scram out of here too. Not so fast, Pizzazz says, because the holograms, since the real holograms are here, they had no idea that we're behind all of this yet. Then Pizzazz made a suggestion and said, now that the real holograms are here, we get to finally know what we know from them. So back with Jim and the real holograms. So the real Kilmer wanted to know from Jim if Jim was okay, especially what I've been through, considering, Jim says, I'm all right. Even though Jim is still confused, and then asked one of her friends, her real friends, why would someone have to go through all this trouble to find out who I really was? Then the real Archer just told Jim, all I can tell is that the actresses are not the only people that are involved. Someone else is involved in it too. So when Asha looks at the top right hand corner on the ceiling and says, here's your answer, there's a surveillance camera right here. So what did Asha do? She takes out a can of hairspray and says, show's over, ladies, and sprays hairspray all over the surveillance camera. Back in the surveillance room, when Pizzazz of the Misfits saw what had happened, she and her bandmates knew that they're in serious trouble. When Roxy shows up minutes later, she says, forget it, we gotta get out of here. Jenna, who agrees with Roxy, went along with her, so that leaves Stormer and Pizzazz. And Pizzazz got upset. She says, I can't believe this. This moment of my life has been ruined. And she ended up throwing a fit in a surveillance room. So now that Jim and the Holograms had left the Wentworth mansion, but then at the last minute, Shannon just heard something coming from inside the surveillance room where the mistress had left from. So they went back into the house and right into the surveillance room, and that's when they saw Prescott, who was locked in the closet thanks to the Misfits. Well, good news, Jim and the Holograms had just got Prescott out of the closet, and Jim was asking him, are you okay? Not only did Prescott tell Jim and the Holmgrens that he's okay, he says, I got a lot to tell you about, but I'm afraid it's a hard pill to swallow to explain all this. Well, try harder, Jim says. Then Jim says, I would have appreciated if you had told me this sooner rather than later. So Prescott says, I'll try. And he started to explain to Jim and her bandmates that this whole mess started with an advertisement that he put on the newspaper. Now, that's the same newspaper that Pizzazz was looking at back at the Gabor estate earlier that day. Then Prescott also said that my only regret is that I was ever involved in this mess in the first place, and I was ashamed about it. So Prescott also explains that by the time that the Misfits responded, they wanted to do what it took to get their hands on Jim's real identity and to find out at last who she really was. And they almost did it too. Now Prescott has another omission to make with Jim to say, I would have told you sooner, but the Misfits locked me in a closet. And now poor Prescott is ashamed for him ever being involved in the mess in the first place and said, True, I was ashamed for what I did, and I wasn't proud of it either, but I couldn't get to you to warn you in time. So Prescott apologized to Jim and then was scared to death that he will never be forgiven for what has happened. Then Prescott says, I really let you down. So Jim told Prescott, Not only will I forgive you, but after what I've been through, let's just hope I don't ever have to go through like this again. But although, Jim says, I did appreciate your honesty. Thank you. And no hard feelings, okay? So now it's time for Jim to get back to Starlight Mansion, the real deal. But Preston says, Before you do, I wish there was some way I can make it up to you. So Prescott suggested that he should be the concert's next sponsor. Of course, it will make Prescott happy if Jim would allow him to be a part of it. Then Prescott said, Even better, I could donate my money to Starlight Charity. At first, Jim declined, but then Prescott says, For the first time in my life, I wanted to donate my money to a better cause. So Jim finally agrees with Prescott's offer. So anyway, Prescott did what he said to do that night at the concert when Jim and the Holmgrens did I Believe in Happy Endings from last season in episode 25. I guess you could say that Prescott learned his lesson and he did what he promised to do use his money for a better cause. And even better, he donated to the Starlight Charity. So that ends episode 6.